Hi everybody, welcome to today's podcast.
Hello there.
Today we're going to be talking about the Donnelly family of Lucan, Ontario. Actually, I did mention that we were going to have footage from Lucan, but we went to so many really cool places and we got so much footage, so we're going to make that a separate video. Sort of like a companion video to the podcast. Anyway, the Black Donnellys. Why are we talking about them? It's very important, I think. It's a real miscarriage of justice. I mean, they were no angels, but the way they went out, the fact that the family didn't get justice for it is a real shame. So we're going to get into it. It's going to be a bit of a long one, so hang in there.
Yeah, bear with us, and we're going to give you all the juicy details.
Yeah, it's really, really big.
So they came from Tipperary in Ireland, leaving due to strife for a new life in Canada, and they could never have foreseen the tragedy the future would hold for them. James Donnelly married Joanna McGee in Ireland in 1840. 1841, James and Joanna Donnelly's first son, James Jr., is born in Tipperary. 1842, James and Joanna sailed to Upper Canada. James may have arrived first, followed by Joanna.
Yeah, so I don't think that they had any of the travel records. I'm assuming that they were either lost or maybe burned up. But they're assuming that maybe James came over first.
Yeah, which I think was kind of like the usual way they did it back then, unless they had money ahead of time. But
it sounds about right. I feel like they would have the husband and go over and maybe secure work or secure a home and then bring his family over, I'm assuming.
Yeah. So between 1844 and 1854, 6 more sons would be born in Upper Canada, and they were William, John, Patrick, Michael, Robert, and Thomas. And in 1858, their only daughter Jenny was born.
Yeah, seven sons and 1 daughter. So that daughter, she must have been a real toughie, probably growing up with all those brothers, especially the Donnellys. Whew.
Oh yeah. So in 1845, the family builds a home on Lot 18, Concession 6 in Biddulph. It was a lot owned by a gentleman called John Grace. So 1855, John Grace sells the southern 50 acres of Lot 18, Concession 6, to Michael Marr for £200. However, the Donnelly family was still living on the land. So not long after the sale of the land that the Donnelly family were living on, James Donnelly is charged with shooting at Patrick Farrell.
Yeah, so already, here we go. Pretty much, here we go. He's been there less than 10 years and already the feuding is starting.
Yeah. In 1856, John Grace applies to eject the Donnelly family from the northern half of Lot 18. Michael Marr does the same for the southern half of the property. And in the end, however, Grace sells James Donnelly the southern half of the property for £50, which is far less than the $200 paid by Marr, and that was due to Donnelly's improvements on the land. But a reflection of the work the Donnellys had put into the developing the lot.
Yeah, and I think this is the start also, well, maybe not the very start, but we were speaking to someone in Lucan who had quite a lot of knowledge about the Donnelly family. Yeah. That's what Lucan's, beautiful town, but I mean, it's definitely, they are Donnelly people, and they're all willing to talk to you about it and answer questions. Yeah. So this person in particular said to us that James Donnelly, the father, made a lot of good business connections. He was very good at networking at the time. And this is going to come into play all through the years, right up until the very end. He knows people in the right places. Yeah.
So 1857, during a logging bee at a neighbor's farm, James Donnelly Sr. kills Patrick Farrell with a handspike. Donnelly goes into hiding, and a $400 reward is offered for his capture. In the London Free Press account of that day, it's reported that Patrick Farrell had attacked James Donnelly with his fists. James Donnelly defended himself with his fists and knocked Farrell down. Then he was walking away, and Farrell had picked up a logging handspike and attacked Donnelly from behind. Donnelly then defended himself with another handspike, and Farrell was killed. And this is why the hanging sentence was commuted on appeal, because the death was in self-defense. These things were well testified at the original trial.
Yeah, and there's, again, it's one of those facts in the case where, depending on who you speak to, many think it wasn't actually self-defense on the part of James Sr. Some people just think that he just wanted to eliminate this Mr. Farrell.
Yeah.
And he was going to do it, but then other witnesses said, but no, it was self-defense. So it's just another mystery within a mystery,
Well, and I think the thing was, too, is he hit this Farrell fella in the forehead with the handpick. So you would kind of have to know what's probably going to happen if you do that.
Well, that's the thing. If it's self-defense, I don't know if you would... Killing in self-defense, I guess, is sort of one thing, but just sort of beating the guy up, giving it back to him, that's another thing. So to me, like, self-defense sort of means like you're fighting back. The killing in self-defense sort of happens like last resort. So the fact that James Donnelly Sr. directly went to sort of killing him,
yeah,
right away, sort of, it shows a lot there.
Yeah. In 1858, James Donnelly Sr. turns himself in and is convicted of the murder of Patrick Farrell and sentenced to death. His wife Joanna and others in the community petitioned for his sentence to be commuted. His sentence is reduced to 7 years in Kingston Penitentiary. Also in 1858, Joanna Donnelly takes out mortgages on the farm but manages to keep the property. Part of the land is sold for a small fee for a schoolhouse for the children of Biddulph.
Yep, and actually that schoolhouse still stands on that piece of the property today. Yeah, she really struggled, but she held on to it. Strong lady. I mean, with all those kids and then her husband in prison, she did good.
Yeah, she pulled everybody through.
Yeah.
Kept everything going.
That's one thing about those Donnellys. I mean, they seem to come out on top. I mean, obviously until the very end, but they can hold their own.
Yeah. So in 1865, James Donnelly Sr. is released from Kingston Penitentiary. So by 1869, his son William Donnelly is charged with larceny by John Graham, but is acquitted. Also in 1869, James Jr. and William Donnelly are charged with robbing the post office in Granton. They're also acquitted for that crime.
Yeah, so now the boys are older, they're starting to commit crimes, and also, most importantly, getting away with these crimes almost every single time. Yeah. Either they got away with these crimes or they just got a, commuted sentence or whatever. They just basically got away with it every time.
So in 1870, the Donnelly boys established themselves in careers. James Jr. moves to Michigan. Patrick trains in wagon and carriage making and marries Mary Ryan. John manages a saloon in Lucan and elopes, but the marriage lasts only a few months. Robert, Michael, and Thomas farm on another property in Biddulph, and William continues to help out on the Donnelly farm.
Yeah, so going good. The boys are working. Somewhat of a normal life.
Yeah. So in 1871, the Donnelly boys begin to work for the stage line owned by McPhee and Keefe. Now, the opposition stage line is managed by John Hawkshaw. 1873, William Donnelly decides to open his own stage line when McPhee folds. Brothers Michael, Robert, and Thomas Donnelly also drive stagecoaches. They join forces with the Calder stage line. There are reports of sabotage of the stages in those days. Also in 1873, William Donnelly asks Margaret Thompson to marry him, although her father, William Thompson, sends her away so that the marriage does not take place.
Yeah, so Donnellys don't have a very good reputation, obviously, in the area, already, of course.
Yeah.
Of course, but I mean, it ruins actually a lot of relationships for them. It's kind of sad.
Yeah, because I think most of the parents in Lucan and Biddulph knew what the Donnellys were kind of all about at the time, and they frowned upon their daughters marrying or having anything to do with the Donnelly boys.
Yeah, which is, I don't know. I think it's a little much. I don't, they were criminals, yes, but also they moved on to have very, successful businesses. It's too bad throughout this whole case that everything resorts to some kind of crime or violence.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
I mean, that was basically the Wild West times of Canada too.
Yeah, true.
Really.
I mean, there wasn't really that much control over people, and I don't think, there wasn't so many things implemented by the government to help or be involved with people. You could kind of be your own person in those days.
It wasn't even, Canada wasn't even actually Canada at the time.
No, that's true.
So there was, it was still pretty random out there. It was still pretty wild.
Yeah.
All happening in Ontario too.
So in 1874, after a series of letters from Margaret in which she asked William to come and get her, William Donnelly and friends searched the Thompson household and the homes of neighbor Ellen Fogarty and William Thompson Jr., looking for Margaret. The group is charged with trespassing, but they're also acquitted.
Yeah, so again, acquitted again.
Yeah. So 1874, Patrick Flanagan opens a rival stage line. Also that year, Michael and James Jr. and Robert Donnelly are ejected from Lot 26, Concession 11. Joseph Carswell is granted the land, but once he takes possession, there are fires on the land and several of his animals die.
Yeah, so,
Yeah, wonder who did that. 1875, William Donnelly marries Nora Kennedy. The marriage angers members of the Kennedy family, including brothers-in-law Rhodey and John Kennedy. Same year, James Donnelly Jr. is charged with stealing and assaulting Thomas Gibbs, who was a fruit vendor. He's convicted of the assault charge, but not the theft charge.
Yeah,
so he still gets off.
Yeah, he's still
one of those things.
Pretty much.
Also in 1875, one of the Flanagan stages is destroyed, and stage driver William Brooks is killed when a wheel falls off.
Falls off.
Yeah, falls off. Sabotage is suspected. Robert McLeod, who works for Flanagan, cuts off the Donnelly stage, causing passengers to fall out of the carriage. Donnelly charges him and receives damages. Louisa and Martha Lindsay charge the Donnellys for dumping them out of the stage, and the Donnellys are forced to pay damages.
I don't think that was their fault.
No, I wouldn't think so. I mean, if they got cut off.
They got cut off.
Yeah. But there was reports that the competition for business for the stage lines got pretty cutthroat in those days. Not only sabotage, but there were reports of clients being grabbed and thrown into the stage and forced on. And you wouldn't feel like going with that. Yeah,
competition was getting fierce because, of course, in comes the railway system. And the transportation of goods was about to get much easier. So that was going to be eliminating a lot of these wagon delivery companies. Oh. So it was getting fierce. Killing somebody.
Yeah. And at first the railroad was only going east to west. So the only run that was left was north to south, and you had a couple of stagecoach companies, so
yeah.
It was getting pretty cutthroat.
Oh, yeah.
So, same year again, Joseph Berryhill challenges James Keefe and the Donnellys to a fight. Keefe and the Donnellys are charged with assault, and Thomas Donnelly is convicted.
Oh.
Yeah.
Different.
Also, James Curry claims that Keefe, James Jr., and Thomas Donnelly attacked and robbed him, but nothing comes of this charge.
Okay. Another point for the Donnellys.
Yeah. So Flanagan and Crawley's stables are burned. Late in the year, Flanagan is beaten and another of his stages is burned. The Donnellys fight with Rhodey Kennedy, who blames the Donnellys for the fire. The Donnellys are acquitted once again, and Kennedy is charged with perjury. So next year in 1876, Peter McKellar has an altercation with the Donnellys. Michael Donnelly is convicted of threatening the life of McKellar. William Donnelly then charges McKellar with threatening him.
Oh.
Rhodey Kennedy is sent to arrest Robert Donnelly, and another fight ensues. McKellar charges William Donnelly with perjury. Also in 1876, Hugh McKinnon, a private detective, arrives in Lucan. He goes to work with constables John Bawden, John Corsi, and John Reed. The constables go to Thomas Ryder's wedding to arrest the Donnellys for a variety of alleged crimes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, everything that they didn't get charged with, they were coming for them now.
Yeah.
At this wedding.
So riot ensues and shots are fired. The Donnellys escape, and a group of townspeople go in search for them. Many come forward to pursue old charges against the Donnellys. Constable Bawden captures Michael Donnelly and holds him in a Lucan hotel, but Michael manages to escape. Most of the charges against the Donnellys with regards to McKellar, Kennedy, and Eastdale lead to no convictions.
Yeah.
However, William and John Donnelly are convicted of the assault of Constable Bawden. William Donnelly is discharged from prison due to illness.
Yeah, so it's there's a whole mix of things going on there, but it was sort of like they were just determined to take these boys down. And the boys weren't really, they, like I said before, they were no angels, but also they weren't the only ones that were doing some shady stuff here. But They just, everybody had it in for the Donnellys, it seemed.
Yeah. So in 1877, violence in Lucan increases. The Donnellys' stables and stages are burned, as is Michael Donnelly's home.
Yeah, rough times.
Yeah.
Holy.
So the Donnellys are blamed for crimes, but there's seldom proof that they are actually the culprits. So the same year, James Donnelly Jr. dies of illness. Some suggest that he might have been shot.
Yeah, I guess there's no record of his death. He passed away. That's the story of his death is kind of like a sort of a passed on. It's a story. I don't think there's anything that was really solidified about how he died, but just that he did in that year. It was very, very hard on the family. That was their firstborn son, too.
Yep. So the next year, the stage lines closed due to the creation of the London, Huron, and Bruce Railway. Troubles between James Carroll and the Donnelly family begin. Carroll charges them with assault, and he charges Joanna Donnelly with using abusive language.
Yeah, so that's Mama.
Yeah.
That's Mama Donnelly with abusive language.
Which is a strange charge, really. I think, even
I guess,
in those days.
They're just attacking each other like crazy.
Yeah.
Even coming right down to that. But I guess, you know what? You're talking about also, mainly an Irish population. And, there's within this case, there's sort of the Protestants versus the Catholics. So I think, like, the Donnellys were Catholic. I'm thinking probably being accused of using abusive language is not good. As for the religious type, you know what I mean? Frowned upon. So I think even something like abusive language could be considered like, wow.
Yeah.
Big deal.
Yeah. The Donnellys accuse James Carroll of threatening to shoot them.
Yeah, so battle of the words now.
Yeah.
Of the threats.
So also in 1878, Constable Samuel Everett claims someone fires a shot at him. He says the guilty party is Robert Donnelly, and Robert is sentenced to 2 years in the Kingston Penitentiary. The next year, in 1879, Constable Everett is convicted of assaulting William Hodgins and another constable. Everett confesses that he is not certain that it was Robert Donnelly who shot him. So, the truth kind of gets out there, but...
It's just so wild to me how even, like, the police are sort of putting their dukes up, like kind of mixing in there.
Yeah.
Like, it's so... What a time. I don't think, I look back and I think, oh, it'd be nice to live in those simpler times, but really, were they simpler? They sound dangerous and scary. I don't know.
I think that's part of it, being simpler, too. There wasn't so much, kind of protection that you would have these days, or evidence,
Less rules, I guess, which, is that actually a good thing? You'd think you would like to live in a world with, less rules and kind of don't fence me in sort of thing, but living at a time like that where it was so wild, I don't know. What's better?
Yeah.
What's better? A bit of 1879, Father John Connolly arrives at St. Patrick's Catholic Church in Biddulph. And we actually went to that church, and that's going to be in our tour video, and it's absolutely breathtaking.
It's a beautiful building.
Yeah, gorgeous. He hears stories about the troublesome Donnelly family and forms a prejudice before meeting them, which is unfortunate, because actually that was the church the Donnellys ended up attending regularly.
Yeah, they're members of the parish.
Yeah. William Donnelly writes to him complaining that he is unfair to the Donnelly family. So a little bit later on that year, in June 1879, Father Connolly founds a peace society and asks everyone in the community to pledge their support.
So, peace society,
yeah,
keep that in mind.
Yeah, they were using that very loosely.
Mm-hmm.
So he wants the community to pledge their support and agree to have their homes searched for stolen property. The Donnellys do not sign the pledge, so Father Connolly wants absolutely clean start. We're going to start from scratch. If you've stolen something from someone, we're going to return it. If you've done something, you're going to face your consequences, and you're going to make an agreement. Now we are going to all get along with each other. The Donnellys flat out refused.
Yeah.
So whether it was that they had stolen property,
more than likely.
Well, yeah, I think a lot of people did, actually. And also, I just feel like they just didn't want, maybe they felt their privacy was being invaded. They certainly didn't like to be told what to do and how to live, so I'm sure that plays a big part in that decision. But they did not sign that pledge, ever. Mm-mm. A couple months later, a splinter group of the Peace Society begins meeting at the Cedar Swamp Schoolhouse in Biddulph. James Carroll is part of the group, and many of the Donnelly neighbors are as well. So I think you see where this is going. The group becomes known as the Vigilante Society, which is a really candy-coated way of saying basically vigilantes.
Yeah.
I guess the muscle of the Peace Society, in other words. Not long after the creation of the Vigilante Society, a cow disappears from Mary and William Thompson's farm. The Vigilante Society, including James Carroll, searches the Donnelly farm for the cow. The cow is later found at home. The Donnellys accuse the group of trespassing, which they were, because they did not sign that pledge, so technically they shouldn't have gone there to search their property whatsoever.
Yeah.
Also, in 1879, coincidentally enough, James Carroll is made a constable, so now...
kind of has the law on his side.
Yeah, so in other words, one of the leaders in this vigilante society is now a constable. So he's a vigilant and is the law.
Yeah.
Pretty much. James Carroll, as a constable, promises to rid the township of the Donnellys, so certainly not unbiased.
No. Definitely they had something against the family.
Yeah, which just, it's terrible. I don't get it. I guess I could see it from their eyes, but it just, those poor Donnellys were sort of just trying to live their life, you know?
Yeah.
He goes to William Donnelly's home to arrest Thomas on old charges. So old charges being brought back up. You really can't do that. I guess sort of back then you could. But if you're charged with something and not convicted of it, they certainly can't go after you again. That's just the way it is now. But back then, they were they're literally grasping at straws doing this.
Anything they could do.
Yeah.
To get at the family, pretty much.
Yeah. But Thomas was at his parents' homestead. William goes to warn Thomas, and John helps Thomas escape. So they're really coming after Thomas Donnelly badly here. The Vigilance Society and Carol search for Thomas. John is charged with aiding Thomas' escape and is later charged with perjury and acquitted.
And Thomas was known as the strongest of the family too, right? He
Oh,
was
yeah.
the big guy, the muscle.
Yeah.
I guess they all kind of had their own characteristics that I think everyone seemed to know. They're pretty well aware of.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, definitely. So Donnellys again acquitted of this charge. Really fabricated charge, obviously. So it's not working for James Carroll.
No, he can't seem to get one over on them, so to speak.
Yeah. I mean, not yet.
No.
Also that year, Carol and the Vigilance Society formed a hate campaign against the Donnellys. Obviously. I mean, it was already pretty much happening, but they made it official. Some neighbors became nervous of associating with the Donnellys, so... You know, it... So sad. The Donnellys didn't stand a chance.
No.
They really didn't.
Nothing they could really do to repair everything.
No.
That wouldn't be giving up everything everything they lived and worked for.
Yeah. Yeah, it's terrible. Michael Donnelly, who had moved to St. Thomas to work for the railway, went to Waterford in the course of his work and is stabbed to death by William Lewis. Lewis is convicted of manslaughter and sent to Kingston Penitentiary. Lewis was a member of the Vigilance Society.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so there you go. In 1880, so this is getting into the year of the tragedy. Robert Donnelly, one of the boys, returns from serving his sentence for allegedly shooting at Constable Everett, which... I don't really think he did, but I mean, they got him there. So he returns. On January 15th, Patrick Ryder's barn burns down. Burning barn, like that, I guess that would be devastating. That would be devastating. I just couldn't even imagine.
Well, and they usually would have help building barns too. Like it was I thought it was like a community thing they would do. So to have it burned down, and you wouldn't think, depending on the person, you wouldn't have help to rebuild it if you weren't liked anyway. But
it's just such a nasty thing to do, considering, these families had whatever they didn't have in the home was in the barn. It was like their everything. There could be livestock, there could be crops, there could be, the wagon. That's a horrible thing to do. Like, that's a biggie. That night, Thomas, John, and William Donnelly are at a wedding, so the Vigilance Society blames James Sr. and Joanna Donnelly for the fire. So the boys were at a wedding, so they went to the next step. Well, if it wasn't the boys, because they had an alibi being at the wedding, they went for Mom and Dad Donnelly and blamed them for the fire of the barn.
Basically, no matter what, it was their fault.
Yeah. Pretty
much.
And James Sr. complained that the Donnellys are unfairly blamed for everything. And true.
Rightly so, yeah.
True.
Yeah.
The massacre itself happened February 3rd, 1880, so about a month later. The Vigilance Society holds a meeting in the Cedar Swamp schoolhouse. They speak to James Fahey and ask him to spy on the Donnellys later that night. The same day, the Donnelly family prepared to attend their trial over the burning of the Ryder barn the next day. The same day, John Donnelly leaves the family farm and goes to William Donnelly's house. So this is placing them in certain areas. And you'll see as the story goes on why we're telling you about sort of where they were. So John Donnelly left the family farm and goes to see his brother William Donnelly on William's farm. and that was in Whalen's Corners, not actually too far away from Lucan, all in the Biddulph area. And he was going to borrow a sleigh to take back to the family farm so he could bring his parents to court the next day. He decides to spend the night at William's home, along with his friend Martin Hogan Sr. Back at the Donnelly homestead, Thomas, Johanna, and James Sr. and James's niece, Bridget, from Ireland, prepare to sleep. So Bridget had just come to visit her aunt and uncle from Tipperary.
Which is a long trip. Also,
it took a while, right? Back in those times, oh my goodness. If you were going to go visit your family over in Canada or whatever, wow, how long would that be?
Well, and especially, you'd have to sail across the Atlantic, which, if I understand, takes maybe 3 months or something.
Oof.
And then you got to make it to central Ontario too, which is pretty deep in Canada. I don't know if she would have gotten off in Quebec and traveled, or maybe even Newfoundland, and that's a long way.
I mean, I guess going anywhere back then would be quite the journey.
Yeah.
James Sr. retires to the bedroom at the front of the house. James Fahely arrives and talks to Thomas, Bridget, and Johanna. When he leaves, Thomas retires to the bedroom off the back kitchen. Bridget and Johanna sleep together in the room next to James Sr.'s room at the front of the house. Shortly before midnight, the Vigilant Society gathers at the Cedar Swamp Schoolhouse again. They go to one of the farms owned by Patrick Ryder, and he was another member of the society. Shortly after midnight, John and William Donnelly and Martin Hogan go to bed at William's place. So the Donnelly homestead, they're settled in for bed. Also at the son William's house, they are also settling in to sleep. Nora Donnelly is already asleep. John and Hogan share one room, and William and Nora another one. An hour later, the Vigilant Society proceeds to the Donnelly homestead. Carol allegedly enters the home first via the back kitchen door and handcuffs Thomas Donnelly.
And again, like we said, Thomas was the strongest member of the family. He was known as the biggest and strongest, so it's a very strategic step to take.
And that's probably the only way they could do it, is when he was sleeping.
Yeah.
Because he was a big dude. He wasn't one you messed with, that's for sure.
No, he was known as being a tough guy.
Yeah, and that was the one they went after first, so certainly planned. Bridget, the niece, and Johanna, that's the mom, awake and start a fire. To light up the place. It was dark, so they wanted to see, what the ruckus was, I guess, in other words. Carol goes to the front room and wakes James Sr. The mob quickly enters the home and attacks James and Johanna. So attacks the parents. Now there was a young fella there, and his name was Johnny. He was taking cover under one of the beds, and he was watching this scene happen. So when you're hearing this account, it's mostly based on young Johnny's testimony about what happened that night. And
Johnny was actually there. He was going to be helping Joanna and Bridget with the chores while the men were in court the next day.
Yeah. He'd come by and he would help them every now and again.
Yeah.
Very, very young. I think he was about 12 years old. So Johnny then followed Bridget and runs upstairs. But she shuts the door before he could get into the room. So he returns to his hiding place under the bed. Later on, Johnny said that he saw Thomas run outside, but Thomas was dragged back into the house. And Johnny said that he saw some of the mob go upstairs to kill Bridget. The mob then spreads coal, oil, all over the home and sets fire to the cabin.
So it was pretty clear what they intended to do.
Yeah, so...
Thomas even actually, when they first attacked him, he was able to break free. And when he made it out the front door, he was met with a pitchfork. Yeah. That's how they got him back into the house.
Yeah. So, Yeah, I think he got stabbed with a pitchfork. Was it in the chest or in the stomach? But I mean, it was a deadly blow, which probably would have killed him anyhow.
Yeah.
You know. At 1:30 a.m., young Johnny flees out of the back door. So he's was in the home as it was burning, and luckily he got out. He fled out the back door, and he goes to the home of Patrick Whalen. Johnny tells them about the murders and the fire, and after some time, they go back to the Donnelly cabin, which is in flames. Bridget's body falls through the main floor of the house, and it snows for most of the night, and the snow covers the scene of the murders. So that would have been quite the thing to see.
It would have been, even in the winter. Like, eventually it would have put the fire out once it all smoldered down, but...
Yeah.
And we went right past where the homestead was. It's a fairly open area. I don't know, back in the day, if there was less fields and more woods around. I think it was all mostly the road and fields, but you would see that for quite a ways.
Oh, a home and barn completely engulfed in flames? Yeah, you sure? You would have seen it for miles, definitely.
Definitely, yeah.
So at 2 a.m., so this is about a half an hour later, after killing Bridget, Thomas, Johanna, and James Sr., the Vigilant Society travels to William Donnelly's house at Whalen's Corners. So they're heading over there to get... Now, they don't know that two of the brothers are there. They are there to get one brother in particular. So they travel over to William Donnelly's house. The mob separates and surrounds the house. Members of the mob shout, "Fire!" hoping to awaken William. Instead, his brother John wakes and goes to the door. He is mistaken for William and is shot allegedly by Martin McLaughlin and James Ryder. And William survived the attack. So they think they got William, but they got John, but they didn't go in after anybody else. Otherwise, they definitely would have gotten William. But William survived. Later on that morning, February 4th, still, neighbors came to view the burned Donnelly home and the remains of the murdered victims. And some people scavenged for souvenirs. And
which is pretty dark.
It's very... yeah, it's really bad. And actually, when we went to the Donnelly Museum, there was not a lot of artifacts, just sort of what could have been recovered from the fire. I guess the families eventually gave up what they had artifacts-wise, as the generations went on. So there's not a whole heck of a lot there. So there could very well be Donnelly souvenirs, as they called it, still out there, And
I think that was quite a thing. Probably up until, like, most of the 19th century, where if there was a person or a group who was mostly hated by society or the surrounding community, they would be kind of made examples of once something happened to them. Even if not to show others not to act that way, but also it's almost like a humiliation after death. Like,
yeah, this is what's going to happen to you. Like, I guess, like, a big example of that would be Bonnie and Clyde. Yeah. So, obviously, they were made an example of. They were absolutely slaughtered. There was no reason why they had to be gunned down so hard. A couple bullets would have taken them out easily.
Yeah.
But they, and then they took pictures of it, and even, I remember seeing pictures of the crime scene, the Bonnie and Clyde crime scene, where the constables and they were smiling in the pictures, like smiling beside the body, smiling beside the car. But I get it. And the same thing had happened here, pretty much with the Donnellys.
Yeah.
The police arrived and put what remains of the bodies into one truck. And as a matter of fact, that's pretty much the way I believe the Donnellys were also buried, is in one... I don't know if they had proper casket or not. I should have actually looked more into that, but they were sort of buried in that manner as well, just sort of basically thrown together in in a casket.
Yeah.
I suppose the condition of their body, they could have done that. It just seems very disrespectful. The whole thing, even after death, they're being attacked, literally. So now we get to the trial, which actually happens right away, pretty much the same day. So this happened overnight, so it'd be the afternoon of the following day. Coroner Thomas Hassett gathers a jury to start hearing testimony at the coroner's inquest. And February 5th, James Carroll and 12 others are arrested for the murders of the Donnelly family. The next day, the funeral was held for the Donnelly family. Father Connolly delivered a controversial funeral address, and it is clear that the community is split over whether the death of the Donnellys is to be celebrated or mourned. So, isn't that horrible?
Yeah, it's hard to say because people had so many hard feelings towards them, but at the same time, I mean, everyone was sort of free to do whatever they were doing at the time. So to pinpoint one particular family,
Yeah, it's a real shame because remember, one of the tour guides at the museum, I believe, had mentioned about James Donnelly Sr., saying that he was actually a very nice man and very accepting of people. They were a Catholic family, but he had Protestant friends. He was not all about sort of the division, and he really wasn't about the fighting either. But he was like a fairly open-minded, but apparently like a good person, and would have done just about anything to be like a really productive member of society. I guess that's how he ended up winning over a lot of his sort of, business connections and whatnot.
That was also a point of contention for a lot of the other families in town and the new priest, was that he was accepting of Protestants because they were vehemently against Protestants at the time. And
yeah, it's the old feud brought over from the old country.
Yeah.
And what is really bad about it is actually the church leaders sort of really promoted this division. They were sort of in on it. They weren't, saying, let's all try to get along here. That wasn't what it was.
No.
They were part of that division. February 11th, the coroner's inquest is re-adjourned. They meet again February 18th and March 2nd. They decide that the Donnellys were murdered by persons unknown. So, a number of times they'd met. I think it was fairly obvious they were murdered. The coroner should have seen that. Even if a body, I guess, is burnt, you can still tell what is happening there. I feel like this is more of like a moral decision on the part of the coroners, right? And everyone else involved. I think they had to decide, as we mentioned earlier, it's sort of like you're taking sides. It's the Donnellys. So, do we say it's murder? Like, we're taking a risk here. We're going to offend, half the population.
Yeah.
So I think that's more what it was. The crime itself was painfully obvious, but it was the moral decision. So young Johnny O'Connor knew all the persons who did the killing and identified them easily. But his testimony was disregarded because of his age, which was 12 years old.
Which is sad, like...
The only witness, and they won't allow it, so... He is young. At the time, like we look at a 12-year-old now, we look at them as a child. A 12-year-old back in 1880 could almost be considered a young adult.
I was going to say, they would be working. I mean, they could work from a young age in those days.
Well, he was working, right?
Yeah.
He was kind of like a little working man.
So, like, to completely disregard his testimony is pretty bad.
Well, I mean, I think we all know why they disregarded that testimony. It was the only testimony, really, that was important here. So they disregarded because they didn't want to set those murder charges.
I think also it was mentioned that the vigilantes didn't actually know that he was there at the time because they weren't expecting him to be, which could also explain sort of how he was able to escape. You'd think, I don't know if they'd want to hurt a child, but you'd think they would at least capture him and say, hey, don't say anything about this, or you didn't see anything. But
I don't know. I feel like if you're willing to kill women, Bridget, who was the niece who was visiting at the time, couldn't have been very old at all.
No, I think she was fairly young still too, yeah.
So if they would kill women and young women, I'm sure they wouldn't have worried about killing Johnny O'Connor. He was a witness.
Yeah.
He's seen it all, so...
True.
And don't forget, this Vigilance Society contains police officers.
Yeah.
Basically. February 21st, 1880, a preliminary hearing is held until March 13th. 6 prisoners, James Carroll, John Kennedy, Martin McLaughlin, Thomas Ryder, James Ryder, and John Purtell, are committed for trial. 2 others, Patrick Ryder Jr. and William Carroll, are allowed out on bail. So... let these potential murderers out on bail.
Yeah.
April to May. So this trial is going on and on and on. Prosecutors, aware of the bias against the Donnellys, ask for a change in venue, but the judge refuses to change the venue. So what does that say? The judge would not... I really feel like the judge just... probably was one of those people that didn't like the Donnellys either, because granting a change of venue would have made it a fair trial, and if he were any judge at all, he would want a fair trial. So for him to refuse that, big suspicion there.
Yeah.
In May, prosecutors appealed to the superior courts for a change of venue, so they went to a higher court over this justice. But the superior court also refused to move the trial. Newspapers take sides in the conflict, and the case is held over until the fall. So February the incident happened, and the trial was not going to be continued until the fall of that year. So just basically dragging their heels, it seems. But through that summer, William Donnelly, so the surviving Donnelly son, works tirelessly to gather evidence for the trial. But there is trouble gathering an unbiased jury, which is also not a good thing. October 4th to 9th of that year, the trial begins under Justice Armour. First on trial is James Carroll, so the leader of that vigilante group, who's also a constable. He's charged with the murder of Johanna Donnelly. The testimony heard is much the same at the inquest and preliminary hearing, so they're not changing their story. Justice Armour issues a strong charge to the jury, but they cannot reach a verdict. 4 of the jury want to convict, 7 to acquit, and 1 is undecided, so that jury is a hung jury. November to December, Attorney General Mowat decides not to wait until spring for another trial to be held, which, this is good. I mean, yes.
Get it done, right?
Yep. He orders a special commission to oversee an earlier trial. He appoints 2 justices, Matthew Crooks Cameron and Featherstone Osler. So we're going to the next year. It's moving along, but it is moving into the next year. So January 1881 to February 1881, a second trial takes place. The jury finds Carroll not guilty of murder. The rest of the prisoners are granted bail and are never tried for the Donnelly murders. So
got off scot-free.
Trials on top of trials, basically 2 trials, and both times this group was not found guilty. Even with this poor young Johnny's testimony,
Disregarded.
Yeah. physical evidence and everything else. I mean, if only they had, DNA and they had, great CSI tools, like it would have made all the difference in the world. But yeah, and actually nobody was charged and nobody was looked at again.
Yeah, that was that. Wash their hands of it.
Yeah, pretty much. The surviving Donnellys befriend James and Michael Fahely despite the action of the Fahelys on the night of the murders. So if you remember, there were members of the Fahely family that were part of that vigilante group. James Fahely confesses to Patrick Donnelly about the night of the Donnelly family murders, but he is afraid of the Vigilante Society, so he confessed his participation in it. And he also admitted to the others participating in it. But he's saying, I'm worried for my life here. Don't say you heard that from me.
Yeah.
Kind of thing. And they might have made a little bit of a deal there. But it was even admitted. In April of that same year, 1881, James and Michael Fahely flee to Michigan. They're running for their lives because I think sort of word had gotten out about the confession. By September of that year, James and Michael are extradited back to Canada. So they were caught and sent back to Canada. They are charged with aiding and abetting the murder of Thomas Donnelly. One charge, aiding and abetting.
Well, they got somebody for it, I guess, but
wait, there's more. The Crown agrees to set them free on bail. The Vigilante Society pays their bail. The Fahelys refuse to testify against anyone, so the chance of a third trial is diminished. So that's a strange twist. So they were afraid of Vigilante Society, but it was a Vigilante Society and ended up bailing them out. And most likely told them, never say a word about this again. You're lucky that you're still on this planet, more or less. That's what I'm thinking.
Yeah, pretty
anyway.
much.
So after the massacre, in 1882, William Donnelly goes to Ohio to work in the coal mines. Patrick Donnelly remains in the wagon-making business. Robert and Jenny Donnelly, so Jenny's the daughter, moved to Glencoe, where Robert owns a hauling business. And Jenny is married to Constable James Curry. So Jenny Donnelly married a policeman. In 1883, William Donnelly returns to Canada and joins his sister and her husband in Glencoe. William himself decides to become a constable. So I don't know. Was it easy to become a constable back then? Kind of seems like it,
Yeah,
eh?
I don't think there was training. It was probably just, you want the job? Yeah, sure. But,
I guess so, eh? You see that in old movies where you want to be the sheriff? Here you go. Here's your badge.
Yeah.
Later in 1889, William would retire as constable. So he didn't do it for very long. 6 years. And he opened a hotel. So, straight up businessman.
Yeah.
In 1885, the Salvation Army comes to Glencoe, but Robert Donnelly does not like their methods of worship and behavior, so it's getting into something again here, The barracks of the Salvation Army are burned out, and Robert is implicated. 1 year later, Robert continues to harass the Salvation Army. So, these Donnelly boys, they just are who they are, I guess. They just feel strongly about something and they act on it.
Yeah.
Also that year in 1889, a large monument to commemorate the Donnellys is raised in St. Patrick's Cemetery. This monument, or sort of like a headstone, but it was quite tall. And we're going to show you that actually in our travel video, in our tour video.
It's almost like a cenotaph, almost.
Yeah, it's quite the thing to see. So it was removed because it was causing a bit of a ruckus, I guess. On that monument, it showed that the Donnellys were murdered. but nobody was convicted of the murder. Although it was determined that they were murdered by unknown persons. But I think some of the members of the accused maybe felt very offended by that, because it almost felt like the finger was still pointing at them, sort of in their face, right? So because of just discrepancies and whatnot, that monument was removed, and there was a new headstone put there that said that they had passed on this day in 1880.
Yeah, so just keep it neutral, no fingers pointed.
Our truth hurts.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
In 1897, William Donnelly dies of natural causes. In 1908, his brother Robert Donnelly is admitted to the London Psychiatric Hospital. From 1911 to 1916, Robert and Patrick Donnelly die of natural causes. Their sister Jenny died in 1916, and she was the last member of the immediate family laid to rest. So that was the end of the immediate family. Though the murderers were not convicted, several of them died gruesome deaths in the following year. So this is a little bit, if you speak anybody or to anyone who has any interest in the case, or even people in and around Lucan, they will say this is a little bit of karma.
Like they got what was coming to them.
Pretty much. They had died of some really, either really gruesome deaths, accidents, really horrible illnesses, painful illnesses. One or two of them were in a carriage struck by a train, actually not long after the trial. And that is the end of pretty much everybody involved there. So, I mean, it's a really interesting case. What a time to be alive.
Yeah, it's definitely a prolific case in Canada. It was taught in schools around the country.
It was taught in schools. Yeah. It's always been there. Actually, in the museum that we went to, they had some of the old books, like the original books that were released about it, some from the 60s. I think the original one was called The Black Donnellys, and sort of that's where the name The Black Donnellys started, was in the 60s. They were never referred to that back in the day.
Yeah.
That was sort of like a term, sort of like a media term, you know? I guess just to make it a little bit more mysterious or spooky, or, you know, jazz up the story a little bit, because a number of novels came out. There were songs written about the Donnellys. So we can look at it now, looking back at the evidence, it's quite clear what happened here. Nothing that can be done about it. It's just a very, very interesting story.
Yeah.
And it's quite amazing if you're interested in law and crime, just to see what people could actually get away with back then. Literally wiping out an entire family.
Yeah.
And then just nothing coming out of it. And it's prejudice. So thank you very much for joining us. It's kind of a long video, but there's a lot of people involved here. So we tried to make it sort of like a timeline where we can get the entire case and sort of get everybody in, so you'll hear the whole story. But we hope you enjoyed. Watch for our next video. It's going to be coming out very, very shortly, about our creep trip, the Donnelly tour that we took around Lucan and around Biddulph County.
Yeah, a lot of interesting stuff we were able to see there, so keep an
Yeah.
eye out.
Yeah, it's really, really fun. Very, very informative. We recommend doing this tour if you can. If not, we will show you.
And also, even just being in the area, Lucan's a beautiful small town. The area is great.
Yes, it's such a nice, and I think I will probably say that a number of times on the video, how much I just adored it out there. And it's such a vibe. And the people are so nice, and they really are just like living this story. It's not their whole life, but they're more than willing to talk about it. And there's just some really neat Donnelly things to see. And
well, and there's a few things about the Irish heritage of the town too, because it was actually most of the immigrants that went there were from Tipperary in Ireland.
Absolutely.
Specifically, so.
Yeah. It's a very, very interesting place. We'll hope that you enjoy the next video as well.
Yeah.
We hope that you enjoyed this one, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks,
and
guys.
We'll see you in the next one.
See you soon.
Bye, guys.
Bye.